The red dust moves before the wind does. It sweeps across the cracked floor of the Texas Panhandle in long, low curtains, the kind that blur the line between earth and sky until you can't tell where the land stops and the darkness begins. A full moon hangs low and swollen over Red Dirt Ranch, bleeding silver light across miles of fenced pasture and dried creek beds. Nothing moves. Nothing breathes. Then she does. Vienna walks barefoot across the gravel toward the outer fence line, her white cotton shirt untucked, her silver-streaked hair loose around her shoulders. No lantern, no rifle, no gloves. She stops at the post where the wire has been torn open like paper, and she extends her hand, steady, open, palm facing the night. The sound that answers her is not a sound at all. It is a force. 600 kilograms of black muscle explodes from the darkness, nostrils flared wide, hooves striking sparks from the stones, teeth bared against the moonlight. The stallion stops 3 feet from her hand and screams. And Vienna does not move. Cut to dawn. A pearl-white sky. 2 pickup trucks idling at the entrance of Red Dirt Ranch, for armed men inside, watching the property through cracked windows. They have come expecting carnage. They have come expecting to find the widow in pieces. Instead, they find her standing on the porch steps, coffee in hand, watching them with quiet, dark eyes. And beside her, motionless as a wall of black stone, stands Goliath, the monster of the Panhandle, the horse that has broken fences, put 3 men in the hospital, and terrified every landowner within 40 miles. He is calm now. He watches the trucks the way a wolf watches something smaller than itself. One of the men reaches for his radio. The trucks reverse without a word spoken and disappear into the dust. Vienna knew that touching that stallion was a death sentence. Goliath was known across Texas as an untamable beast, a creature that shredded anyone who crossed his path. But when the sun rose, the same violent men who wanted to destroy the widow's ranch stopped at the road, and not one of them dared set foot on her land. What terrible secret did Vienna's touch awaken in that animal to paralyze an entire cartel? Before we go back to that fence line and the night that changed everything, I want to ask you something. If you found an injured creature that the entire world was afraid of, would you reach out your bare hand in the dark and trust that it would not destroy you? Most people would say no. Most people have never been desperate enough. But desperation and courage look identical from the outside, and Vienna knew the difference. Drop in the comments right now. What would you have done if you were standing at that fence? Would you have reached out, or would you have walked back inside and locked the door? If a story about a widow, a broken horse, and a corrupt town in the Texas dust is the kind of thing that gets into your chest and stays there, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell us what city you are watching from tonight. Your city might show up in our next story. Now, let us go back to Red Dirt Ranch, to the beginning of it all. The land had belonged to the Callaway family for 4 generations before Vienna married into it. She had not grown up in Texas. She had grown up in the Florida Panhandle, the daughter of a field medic who treated migrant workers along the highway camps between Pensacola and Tallahassee. Her father had taught her that the body, human or animal, telegraphs its pain before it speaks it. He had taught her to read the tightening of a jaw, the shortening of breath, the way a creature holds itself differently when something inside it is screaming. It was a language without words, and Vienna had learned it young and kept it sharp her entire life. She met Dale Callaway at 26 at a livestock auction in Amarillo where she had gone to help a veterinary friend document stress behaviors in penned animals. Dale was 32, quiet in the way that men who work alone on wide land tend to be quiet, not shy, but settled. He watched things before he spoke about them. He laughed slowly. He held the fence wire for her without being asked when she climbed through, and when she thanked him he said, "The land doesn't care about manners, ma'am, but I do." They were married 9 months later. Red Dirt Ranch covered 412 acres of what outsiders called wasteland and Dale called inheritance. The soil ran orange-red from iron oxide. The grass grew in tough clumps between limestone outcroppings, and in summer the heat pressed down on everything like a flat iron. But beneath that unforgiving surface, deep beneath it, ran something that men with money had begun to notice. Oil, black and old, and worth more per acre than the cattle above it would ever be. Dale had known about the geological surveys. He had refused 3 offers to sell in the last 2 years of his life. The third offer had come from Judas Crane. Judas Crane was the kind of man who wore a custom hat to a county funeral and called it respect. He served simultaneously as mayor of Harlan's Crossing and as senior partner in Crane and Holloway Financial, the only bank within 60 miles willing to extend rural credit. He had been born poor, which he hid with great effort, and had built his influence the way termites build inside walls, invisibly, until the structure was already hollow. His left hand was the law. His right hand was the loan. And when neither hand worked fast enough, he kept a third option in a locked office drawer. Men who would take a night drive for the right amount of cash. Dale Callaway had said no to Judas Crane's offer on a Tuesday. On a Friday, 3 weeks later, Dale was found face down in the south pasture. The county medical examiner, a man who owed 2 outstanding loans to Crane and Holloway Financial, ruled it a cardiac event. No external injuries noted. No further investigation requested. Vienna did not accept that. But grief and disbelief are a fog, and the fog had not yet lifted when the bank paperwork arrived the following month. A mortgage she had never signed. A lien she had never agreed to. A debt of $240,000 with a 90-day repayment window, and the name of her husband forged at the bottom of every page. She hired one attorney. He dropped the case within a week, citing a conflict of interest he refused to name. She hired a second attorney. He did not return her calls. So Vienna did what she had always done when the world refused to cooperate. She went quiet, went still, and started paying attention. Red Dirt Ranch held 11 cattle, 2 horses, 1 old border collie named Press, and Riggs, the capataz, the foreman, who had worked the land since before Vienna had ever arrived. Riggs was 61, deliberate in everything. A man who could read weather by the way the mockingbirds flew and who had spent 40 years watching the way the county worked without ever saying enough of what he knew aloud. He stayed after Dale died. He never explained why. He didn't have to. The ranch operated on fumes. Vienna sold 2 cattle, repaired the broken irrigation herself, and drove the old flatbed to Amarillo once a week to sell dried chiles and hand-pressed soaps at the farmer's market. The kind of economic desperation that the people of Harlan's Crossing watched from a polite distance without offering help. They were afraid of Judas Crane the way people are afraid of winter. Not personally, but deeply, in the body. It was in this period, 4 months after Dale's death, 6 weeks before the bank's repayment deadline, that Goliath began appearing at the edges of the property. The stories about him had been circulating for almost a year. A black stallion of abnormal size, part draft horse by the width of his chest, part something wilder by the shape of his skull. He had appeared first near the Garza property to the north, putting a hired hand through a wooden fence and leaving a trail of destruction across the vegetable crop. Then the Pena family to the east had found their fence line demolished, their horses scattered, their barn door splintered from a single kick. 3 ranchers had tried to capture him. One ended up with a broken collarbone, another with a concussion. The third never spoke publicly about what happened. The rumor in Harlan's Crossing was that the horse was cursed, devil-bred, the kind of animal that existed only to destroy. Nobody asked why a horse that large would be running loose in the Panhandle with no brand, no herd, and no origin anyone could trace. Vienna noticed that detail. She wrote it down in the small notebook she kept by the kitchen window. And then, on a moonlit Tuesday in October, 4 days before the bank's deadline, Goliath hit the fence line of Red Dirt Ranch for the first time. She heard him before she saw him. Not the crashing, the breathing. A horse in extreme pain breathes differently than a horse in extreme rage. And in the 17 seconds between waking and reaching the window, Vienna had already begun to separate the sounds. The hooves against the soil were uneven. The rhythm of his movement was wrong. Something in him was compensating for something that hurt. She lit no lights. She dressed in the dark, pulling on jeans and the old cotton shirt she wore for early feeding rounds, and she walked out the back door into the October chill without her boots. Gravel bit into her feet. She did not rush. The fence line on the eastern edge had been torn in 4 places. The wire lay curled back like peeled skin, and 2 fence posts had been driven sideways into the dirt by impact. Press, the border collie, sat 15 feet back from the breach and would not move forward. He was trembling. Goliath stood in the middle of the pasture, inside the property now, and he was enormous in the moonlight, a black mass of muscle and fury, his chest heaving, his breath steaming in the cold air. He had turned to face her the moment she cleared the back gate. His ears were flat. His eyes showed white at the edges. Vienna stopped. She did not raise her hands. She did not call out. She simply stopped moving and let him look at her. In her father's medical camps, she had learned that the first rule of approaching a frightened creature, human or animal, was to remove your own urgency from the equation. Not just to slow down, to actually become slow. To drain the adrenaline from your own posture until your body stopped transmitting threat. It was harder than it sounded, because the body wants to respond to danger with speed, and she was standing 20 feet from a horse that had broken a man's collarbone. She stood in the cold and breathed in through her nose, out through her mouth, and counted the breaths. On the 8th breath, Goliath's ears shifted, not forward. That would come later, but they released some of their backward tension. A degree of change so small that only someone watching for it would see it. She took one step, stopped, breathed. She took another. The stallion did not charge. He held his position, trembling in a way that had nothing to do with cold, and Vienna read that trembling the way she had read 1,000 bodies before his. Not violence in that shaking, something else. Something that was trying very hard to hold itself together. When she was close enough, she stopped again and simply extended her right hand, palm up, fingers loose, no sudden movement, and waited. Goliath pressed his nostrils to her palm. She did not grip him. She did not reach for the halter that hung on the fence post behind her. She let him take exactly as much of that contact as he chose, and when his massive head began to drop, fractionally, a centimeter at a time, she moved her hand slowly to his jaw and then upward, to the flat bone beneath his left ear. She found the pressure point that ran below the pole, the junction of neck and skull, and she applied a slow, circular pressure, the kind that drops cortisol levels in large animals the way a key drops a lock. Her father had taught her this on a mule that had lost a foal, using it to prevent the animal from injuring itself in grief. She had used it twice since then. It had worked both times. Goliath's legs stopped trembling in under a minute. In the new stillness, she began to move her hands across his body in the way a diagnostician moves, not petting, but reading, down the neck, across the shoulder. And when she reached the left shoulder blade, her fingers found it. She almost pulled her hand back. The iron was embedded deeply, not on the surface, but driven into the muscle at the shoulder's junction, packed in by repeated impact and swelling. A spur, not the blunt decorative kind, a sharpened training spur, the illegal type, its shaft filed to a point and then wrapped with a cloth to muffle sound. The flesh around it had been pushed inward and had begun to granulate. This had been there for weeks, maybe longer. Every movement Goliath made with his left foreleg would send the point of that iron shifting against the muscle tissue. Every gallop, every fence he struck, every time a person approached and startled him into motion. He had been living inside an invisible fire. Vienna went back to the house for what she needed. She moved slowly, unhurried, and when she returned, she carried a kit she had kept since her years assisting in migrant healthcare. Alcohol, suture material, hemostatic gauze, forceps wrapped in a clean cloth. She spoke to Goliath the entire time she worked. Not commands, not reassurances, just a low, continuous murmur, the same tone she might use reading a letter aloud to herself, keeping the sound steady so his nervous system could use it as an anchor. The removal took 38 minutes. When the iron came free, Goliath shuddered the way a tree shudders when lightning passes through it, the whole body in one long wave, and then went still. Vienna pressed the gauze to the wound, held it, and talked. She cleaned the site. She packed it. She tied a loose wrap around his shoulder that would hold until morning, and then she sat down in the dirt beside him, her back against his foreleg, and listened to his breathing slow from labor to something close to sleep. At first light, she stood and looked at what she held in her hand. The spur was iron, hand-forged, and it was not plain. Along the shaft, just above the point, someone had etched a small decorative mark, a stylized crane, wings spread, not more than an inch long. The same mark that appeared on the embossed letterhead of Crane and Holloway Financial. She closed her fist around it. 40 minutes later, when the two pickups rolled down the county road and slowed at her gate, Judas Crane's men, expecting to find her gone or broken or dead, they found Vienna Callaway on her porch with coffee going cold in her hand, and beside her, enormous and motionless and watchful, a black horse who looked at those trucks with the particular stillness of something that has decided it will not run anymore. The driver of the lead truck put the vehicle in reverse. He did not explain why. He did not have to. Some things the body understands before the mind finds the words. Riggs arrived at the ranch before 7 that morning. He did not come because she called. He came because he had been watching the county road from his property 3 miles east, and when he saw the pickups reverse, he understood that something had shifted in a way that could not be ignored. He drove in silence, parked at the gate, and walked the length of the drive with his hat in his hand, which was something Vienna had never seen him do before. He kept it in his hands the entire walk to the porch. She set a second cup of coffee on the railing without being asked. He sat on the top step and looked at the cup for a while before he reached for it. She placed the iron spur on the railing between them. Riggs picked it up. He turned it in his fingers without looking at her. His face did not change, but his jaw tightened, the kind of tightening a man does when he's been holding something back for a long time and has just been handed the door he's been looking for. "That's Crane's mark," he said. She had already known. She waited. Riggs set the cup down. He set the spur down beside it. He looked out at the pasture, where Goliath stood near the water trough, head low, the bandaged shoulder catching the early light. "There's something I should have told you," he said, when Dale died. "I should have told you before the medical examiner came. I should have told you before you signed anything. I didn't. And I have carried that every day since. And I'm not going to ask you to forgive me for it, because I don't deserve to ask that yet." Vienna said nothing. He told her. The night Dale died, Riggs had been at the fence line of the south pasture at dusk, checking the water flow on the irrigation valve that ran along the boundary. The sun had dropped fast the way it does in October, one moment light, and then not, and in the blue-gray that followed, he had seen 2 figures moving across the far pasture toward where Dale was working on the tractor. He had not thought much of it at first. He had assumed they were ranch hands from a neighboring property. He had turned back to the valve. Then he heard the voices escalate. The sounds of a confrontation, not violent yet, but on the edge of it. He moved toward the sound, but the distance was more than 200 yards and the ground was uneven. And by the time he cleared the tree line at the property's edge, it was over. Dale was down. The 2 men were gone. And Goliath, the horse that no one had yet identified, the horse that had appeared in the region only weeks before, was standing over Dale's body, trembling, his hooves planted as if he had placed himself there deliberately. Riggs had called the ambulance. He had stood with Dale until it came. He had not told the paramedics what he had seen because he did not understand yet what he had seen, and because one of the men he had glimpsed at a distance had been wearing the kind of hat that only one man in Harlan's Crossing wore. A custom hat, wide brim, silver band, Judas Crane's hat. When the medical examiner ruled it a cardiac event without requesting so much as a tox screen, Riggs had understood the shape of what he was dealing with. He had said nothing because he was 61 years old with no money and no lawyer and no evidence that would survive a courtroom controlled by a man who owned the courthouse mortgage. And because he was afraid in the way that men who have seen something they can't unsee are always a little afraid, not of dying, but of having died for nothing. Vienna listened to all of it. She picked up the spur from the railing and turned it in her fingers. The crane mark caught the light. She thought about Goliath standing over Dale's body in the dark, trembling. She thought about what it would take to transform that same animal, that protective, suffering animal, into a weapon of fear, to plant iron in his flesh and drive him half mad with pain so that he would terrorize the very properties and people he had previously protected. Judas had not only killed her husband, he had tortured Dale's last witness into a legend of violence. He had turned the most honest thing in that pasture into a monster that everyone feared and no one would approach. The genius of it was its cruelty, and the cruelty of it was almost perfect. Riggs looked at her. He was waiting for something. Rage, maybe, or collapse, or the kind of cold silence that precedes a terrible decision. He had known women like Vienna before. He knew the way still water hides its depth. What she said was, "Does anyone else know what you just told me?" "One person," Riggs said. "The county sheriff in Reeves County. Not Harlan's Crossing. The next county over. I sent him a letter 2 months ago. Anonymous. He wrote back to a post office box I set up in Midland and told me he had been looking at Crane's operations for over a year and needed evidence with a living name attached to it." Vienna set the spur in her shirt pocket. "Then we need to give him one," she said. Within 48 hours of Goliath's arrival at Red Dirt Ranch, the story had spread through Harlan's Crossing the way brush fires spread in October. Fast, low, and impossible to catch once it had a direction. No one would enter the property. It had started with the 2 pickups reversing, which 3 people saw from the highway. Those 3 people told others. By noon on the first day, The image of Vienna Callaway standing on her porch with that black stallion at her side had been described, embellished, and repeated enough times that it had acquired the quality of something legendary, the kind of story that people half believe precisely because they cannot explain it rationally. Goliath had put men in the hospital, and now he stood calm beside a widow who had not even flinched. People began to give the ranch a wide berth the way they give wide berth to something they cannot categorize. When Vienna drove into town for supplies, conversation stopped, not out of hostility, out of something closer to awe, which is a form of hostility's neighbor. She bought her goods, she said nothing about the horse, and she drove home. But the distance the town kept was not safety. It was theater. Judas Crane sat in his office above the bank and absorbed what his men told him. His jaw worked slowly, the way it did when he was turning something over in the part of his mind where he kept his contingency plans. He was not afraid of a horse. He was afraid of time. The Federal Geological Survey that had quietly contracted with his shell company required drilling rights to begin within 6 months, and Red Dirt Ranch sat directly above the most productive seam. Every week the Callaway widow held that land was a week that contract inched toward default. He could not move on the ranch while Goliath stood there. His men had made that clear without saying so directly. They had reversed instead of parking, and that reversal had cost him something he could not easily recover: the impression of inevitability. Judas Crane had always derived his power from the certainty that there was no other option. The widow had introduced an option, so he moved to the pipes. The water supply to Red Dirt Ranch ran through a secondary municipal line that passed through the Crane and Holloway easement on the county road. It was a legacy arrangement from 30 years ago, never formally updated, technically under maintenance jurisdiction of the city, which meant the mayor had discretionary authority over it. 3 days after the pickups reversed, a work crew appeared on the county road and installed a shutoff valve. By evening, Red Dirt Ranch had no running water from the municipal line. Vienna found out when the trough ran dry. She checked the pipes herself, traced the interruption to the easement junction, and drove to the county road to look at the new valve. It was padlocked. The work crew had left no notice, no paperwork, no contact information. Just an orange flag in the dirt and a padlock the color of rust. She drove back to the ranch, filled every container she owned from the well pump at the back of the property, which ran from a private aquifer and produced enough for the horses and the household, but not for the cattle, and began rationing. Riggs watched her work and said nothing for a long time. Then Judas filed through the county court, Judge Holloway presiding, the same Holloway whose name was on the bank letterhead, an emergency agricultural lien. The document claimed that Red Dirt Ranch had violated the terms of its existing debt agreement, and that as a consequence, the court had authorized the seizure of all remaining livestock within 24 hours as collateral to be liquidated at the creditor's discretion. 11 cattle, her last income. Riggs read the paperwork twice at the kitchen table. Vienna sat across from him and drank water from a mason jar. Neither of them spoke for a while. The clock on the wall ticked. It was Riggs who finally said, 24 hours is not enough time to fight this in court, even in the next county over. He's using the clock as the weapon. She looked at the wall where Dale's photograph hung, not a wedding photo, but one taken from the back of the flatbed during a fence repair, Dale looking back over his shoulder at whoever held the camera, squinting in the sun, an ordinary moment that she had not known would be the last photograph ever taken of him. "I know what the clock is for," she said, "and I know how to use the night." Riggs looked at her. She told him what she needed. The men came at 3 in the morning. There were 5 of them, and they came without headlights on the last quarter mile, which meant they had practiced this approach or run it once before to memorize the terrain. 2 on foot through the eastern fence line, the same breach Goliath had created, now repaired with new wire, and 3 in a truck that rolled to a silent stop 200 yards from the barn. Each of the foot team carried a tranquilizer launcher, the kind used by wildlife management operations, fitted with heavy load darts capable of dropping a horse Goliath size in under 90 seconds. The 3 from the truck carried tools, a cutting torch, a fireproof satchel, and a radio transmitter tuned to a private frequency. Their objective, as given to them through an intermediary by Judas Crane, was twofold. First, neutralize the horse permanently, not sedate and relocate, permanently. Second, access the locked gun safe in the main house, where Vienna kept the original land deed, the original mortgage documents, and the geological survey copies she had requested from the state land office. Burn them inside the satchel. Leave nothing recoverable. It was a clean plan. It would have worked on a different ranch against a different horse. Goliath heard them at the second fence line. Vienna did not know what he heard. The displacement of gravel under careful boots. The faint metallic click of a tranquilizer chamber being loaded. A frequency of breath that was not the breath of someone who belonged there. But she was woken by a sound she had never heard the horse make before. Not a cry. Not an alarm call. Something below that register. A single low vibration, almost a hum, that she felt in her sternum before she heard it through the walls of the house. She was up before she was fully awake. She moved to the window first. The ranch was dark in the way that 3 in the morning is dark, not the clean dark of early night, but the heavy, exhausted dark that precedes dawn. She studied the yard for 4 seconds, then moved to the back room where Riggs slept in the bunkhouse addition. She did not knock. She opened the door and said, "They're here." Riggs was already sitting up. They had not discussed the full plan in front of each other. There were things Vienna had known she would need to improvise and things she had known she could not predict. But she had spent the last 2 days thinking about the nature of the trap. A man like Judas Crane communicated through intermediaries. He did not put his orders in writing. He did not appear in person at the dangerous events. He gave verbal instructions over a trusted radio line to a field coordinator, and the field coordinator relayed to the men. It was a system designed to create distance between the order and the outcome. The radio transmitter the crew had brought to coordinate the operation, the private frequency device, tuned to Crane's own office receiver, was already broadcasting. It broadcast everything. Goliath had pressed himself against the eastern wall of the barn when the foot team moved around the far side, and his position had the effect of channeling the men's approach into a narrow corridor between the barn and the property fence, a corridor that Vienna and Riggs entered from the opposite end in complete silence. Riggs carried nothing but a rope and a handheld spotlight. Vienna carried the recorder she had borrowed from a musician friend in Amarillo, a small device capable of capturing audio at room quality, already running. When the 2 men with the tranquilizer launchers came around the corner of the barn, they found the corridor blocked. Not by Vienna, not by Riggs, by Goliath, perfectly still, immense. Looking at them the way an eclipse looks at the ground, the men backed up. One of them raised the launcher. Goliath charged, not at them, but at the fence beside them, and the impact sent the corner post sideways with a sound like a gunshot, which startled both men into dropping their equipment and running. The 3-man truck team, hearing the crash over their radio and seeing the signal on their frequency scramble, drove away without understanding why. They left the radio transmitter on the ground beside a dropped tranquilizer launcher and a set of wire cutters. Vienna picked the transmitter up and held it close to the recorder. The frequency was still open. From Judas Crane's office, on the private line, his voice came through the static, urgent, angry, issuing instructions to his field coordinator about the documents in the safe, about the necessity of making the widow's death look like an accident, about the falsified medical report he had paid the former county examiner to produce in exchange for a debt cancellation, about the drilling contracts already signed under the assumption that Red Dirt Ranch would be vacated within the week. He spoke for 4 minutes and 30 seconds before the transmission cut. Vienna stopped the recording. Riggs stood beside her in the cold dark of the barn, listening to the silence that followed, and he looked at the recorder in her hand with an expression she had never seen on him before. Something that started as disbelief and became, slowly, something like hope, the dangerous, fragile kind that only appears when a person has been without it for a very long time. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she agreed. The morning of the court-authorized seizure arrived under a flat, pale sky. By 8 o'clock, people had already gathered on the county road, not because anyone had organized it, but because Harlan's Crossing was the kind of town where everyone knew when something was about to end, and endings drew people whether they deserved to witness them or not. Trucks parked along the shoulder. Men stood at the fence posts with their arms folded. Women stood in the truck beds to see over the crowd. Children sat on tailgates, not understanding, absorbing the silence of the adults around them the way children absorb everything, through the skin. Judge Holloway's sheriff deputy arrived at 8:15 in the official county vehicle, the papers visible in his hand through the windshield. Behind him came Judas Crane's personal truck, a black F-350 with chrome trim that cost more than most of the farms in that county. And behind that, 2 more vehicles with his men. And at 8:23, the The front door of Red Dirt Ranch opened. Vienna did not come out on foot. She came out on Goliath. No saddle, no bridle, only a loose lead rope that she held more as a formality than a constraint, because the horse moved beneath her not because he was directed, but because he chose to, and the difference was visible to everyone watching. He came down the drive at a walk, slow, unhurried, his enormous hooves striking the gravel in a steady 4-beat rhythm, and every person on the road went quiet in the way that crowds go quiet when something appears that does not fit any category they have prepared for. Riggs walked beside them, holding the radio transmitter and the recording device. Judas Crane got out of his truck. He was dressed for the occasion. The custom hat, a pressed shirt, a belt buckle the size of a playing card. The costume of a man who had decided the audience was already his. He carried a file folder of documents in his left hand and his phone in his right, already filming. He was going to make the seizure look like a legal proceeding for any cameras that might be watching. He looked at Vienna on the horse and allowed himself a slow, deliberate smile. "Fine animal," he said, "for a widow's ranch." Vienna did not answer him. She looked at the people gathered on the road. She spoke to them instead, not loudly. The crowd had gone so quiet that she didn't need to raise her voice. "My husband is buried on this land," she said. "He was killed on it, not by a heart attack, by men who worked for the man standing next to that truck, because he wanted to drill for oil on soil that doesn't belong to him and never will." Judas opened his mouth. Riggs pressed play on the recording. Judas Crane's voice came out of the small speaker at full volume in the open morning air, unprocessed, undeniable, recognizable to every person in the county who had ever sat across from him at a bank desk or a town hall. And it said the things that it had said in the private dark of 3 in the morning. The falsified medical report, the drilling contracts, the orders to make the widow's death look like an accident, the name of the county examiner who had been paid, the forged mortgage documents, the water line shut down. For minutes and 30 seconds of a man destroying himself with his own words. The deputy holding the seizure papers stood very still. Judas Crane stood very still. Then he dropped the file folder, reached inside his jacket, and pulled out a pistol. He aimed it at the recorder. He intended to destroy the device. He was still in the part of his mind that believed evidence could be managed, that objects could be silenced, and he had not yet understood that the recording had been transmitted to a cell phone in Reeves County the night before and was already in a server he would never reach. Goliath recognized him. Whether horses remember the specific humans who have harmed them is a question that behavioral scientists have debated for decades. What is not debated is that horses remember threat. They carry the neurological imprint of a traumatic event in their body the way a scar carries an injury, not as thought, but as reflex. Goliath had spent weeks in agony because of the iron in his flesh. He had been driven into fences, into panic, into the destruction of property and the terrorizing of people by a pain that never stopped. And the man who had ordered that iron placed had a smell, a posture, a frequency of presence that lived in the horse's nervous system like a live wire. When Judas Crane raised the pistol, Goliath launched. Not a charge, a leap. An upward, forward motion of 600 kilograms that cleared the gate and came down on the hood of the black F-350 with a sound like the earth being struck. The hood collapsed. The windshield shattered. The truck lurched sideways into the ditch and Judas Crane was thrown from his feet into the mud beside the road, the pistol skidding 10 feet from his hand, the custom hat landing crown down in the drainage ditch. Goliath stood on the crumpled hood of the truck, chest heaving, and looked down at the man in the mud. Judas did not move. The crowd did not breathe. And then Vienna said, simply, quietly, the single syllable she had taught him over the past 2 days in the quiet of the barn, a sound between a click and a word that she had used each time he calmed, each time he chose stillness over panic. Goliath stepped down from the hood of the truck. He turned. He walked back to Vienna's side and stopped there. She put her hand on his neck without looking at him. She kept her eyes on the crowd. Judas Crane was on his hands and knees in the mud, unarmed, looking up at the people who had spent years pretending not to see what he was. Some of them looked away. Some of them did not. From the south, sirens. The flat, steady tone of vehicles moving fast on an open highway. 3 sheriff's department cruisers from Reeves County came down the county road and stopped at the edge of the crowd. The lead deputy, a tall woman named Price whom Riggs had spoken to on the phone the night before, stepped out of the vehicle and walked through the people with the particular calm of someone who has been waiting a long time to do something and is finally doing it. She passed Vienna without looking at her, though the corner of her mouth moved in a way that might have been something. She stopped in front of Judas Crane. She said, "We've had a warrant for you for 11 months, Mr. Crane. We were just waiting for someone brave enough to put their name on the evidence." The arrest took less than an hour. Judas Crane, his field coordinator, two of the men from the previous night, and the former county medical examiner were taken into Reeves County custody by noon. Judge Holloway was served with a separate federal notice by the end of the week. The forensic accounting of Crane and Holloway's loan documents had been under review by a state banking commission for months, triggered by a complaint filed by a rancher 3 counties east who had lost his land to the same forged mortgage scheme and had, unlike most, documented everything. The deputy from Reeves County, Price, spent 2 hours at the kitchen table of Red Dirt Ranch going through the recordings, the iron spur, Riggs's written statement, and the photographs Vienna had taken of the pipeline valve and the falsified mortgage papers. She was precise and unhurried, and when she was done, she looked at Vienna and said, "You knew he was going to come back for the documents." "I knew he thought the documents were the only thing standing between him and that land," Vienna said. "And is he right?" Vienna thought about it for a moment. "He was wrong about almost everything else," she said. "He was wrong about that too." The crowd that had gathered on the county road did not disperse quickly. People stood around longer than was strictly necessary. Near their trucks, near the fence posts, near the collapsed gate where Goliath had gone over, with the particular discomfort of people who are reckoning with their own role in something they wish they had interrupted sooner. Some of them drove away without approaching Vienna. She understood. Shame makes people absent. But others came through the gate, one by one, in the way that people come when they know they have no claim to forgiveness but need to offer something anyway. Marta Garza, whose property to the north had been the first Goliath destroyed, brought a jar of honey and could not find words. Old Benny Pena came with his hat in his hand and his grandson beside him and said only, "I'm sorry we didn't come sooner." Vienna looked at the grandson, 6 years old, watching her with enormous eyes, and said, "Now you know that sooner is always better." Riggs stood by the barn through most of it and let her receive them without interference. He had the expression of a man who has been holding a very heavy thing for a very long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. Press, the border collie, lay in the patch of sun near the porch steps and watched everything with supreme territorial satisfaction. By evening, the municipal water line had been reconnected. A crew from the county public works appeared without being called and cut the padlock off the valve, and Red Dirt Ranch had running water again. Vienna stood at the kitchen window and watched it come back through the faucet. She turned the tap on and let it run longer than necessary, watching the water pool in the basin and drain, watching the ordinary miracle of it. Behind her, outside through the open screen door, she could hear Goliath moving around the paddock, the slow, unhurried sound of a horse who was choosing where to stand. She had not cried since the night Dale died. She did not cry now, but she stood at that kitchen window for a long time with the water running, and whatever passed through her in that silence was something she did not have a name for. Not grief exactly, not relief exactly, something that was both of those things, and also something older, the kind of feeling that lives in the body before language gets to it. She turned the faucet off. She went outside. 7 months later, the county road that ran past Red Dirt Ranch had acquired a new sign. It was hand-painted, cedar wood, and it read, "Goliath Sanctuary, Equine Rehabilitation Center." The lettering was done in black over red, which Vienna had chosen because it matched the soil. The sign had been approved by the county board, a newly reconstituted board, with Judas Crane's seat filled by a woman who had run the local veterinary supply for 20 years and had been waiting that entire time for someone to ask her to do something useful. The sanctuary occupied the original 412 acres of Red Dirt Ranch, plus an adjacent 60 acres that had been acquired through the settlement proceedings. The drilling contracts Crane had signed with the shell company were voided by the state attorney general's office after the federal investigation into the geological survey contracting revealed a pattern of fraudulent land acquisition across 7 counties. Red Dirt Ranch sat on those acres the way it always had. The orange soil, the limestone outcroppings, the grass in its tough clumps, and no machinery would ever touch what was beneath it. Vienna had made sure of that through a conservation easement that ran for 99 years. The indemnification paid by the estate of Crane and Holloway Financial, seized in the criminal proceedings, covered the initial construction of 3 rehabilitation paddocks, a medical barn with proper surgical lighting, and a covered arena large enough to work even the most traumatized animals without constraint. It also covered 2 full-time staff positions, the first of which Riggs filled without being asked and without accepting a formal title, because he said titles were for people who needed something to put on a wall. The first horse they took in after Goliath was a gray quarter horse mare named Colt, who had been confiscated from a rodeo contractor in Lubbock after video of her treatment circulated online. She arrived in a trailer on a Tuesday morning, trembling and hostile, and Vienna spent the first hour standing at the fence of her paddock doing nothing except being present, not trying to touch her, not speaking, just occupying the same air, until the mare's breath began to slow. By the end of the second week, the mare would take feed from Vienna's hand. By the end of the first month, Colt would walk to the fence when Vienna appeared at the far end of the paddock. It was not fast work. Vienna had not expected it to be fast. Damage of the kind these animals carried did not respond to urgency. It responded to consistency, to the same hand, the same voice, the same unhurried presence appearing at the same time each morning until the nervous system learned that presence was not a threat. She had been teaching that lesson her whole life. She had simply not known until now what classroom she had been preparing for. The families of Harlan's Crossing began coming out to the sanctuary on weekends, not as tourists exactly, but as people who needed to be near something that was healing. Children who had grown up afraid of Goliath's legend came and stood at the fence of his paddock and watched him with the quiet astonishment of people who discover that the thing they feared was never monstrous, only hurt. Vienna let them watch. She answered their questions patiently and without drama. Goliath moved through the sanctuary the way rivers move through land, on his own terms, in his own direction, at his own pace. He was not gentle exactly. He was not tame. He was simply himself, which turned out to be something quite different from the creature that had been constructed by pain and deliberate cruelty and the fear of others. He still spooked at unfamiliar vehicles. He still pressed his ears back when strangers moved too fast. He still had the scar on his left shoulder, pale against the black hide, that would never fully disappear. But in the mornings, before the staff arrived and before the day organized itself into tasks and schedules, Vienna would walk out to the middle paddock with a cup of coffee still warm from the kitchen. And Goliath would come to the fence, not because he had been trained to, not because she had food, because he had learned, in the slow and irreversible way that animals learn the things that matter, that the woman who had sat in the dirt beside him on a cold October night and removed the thing that was destroying him was worth walking toward. She would rest her hand on the fence rail, and he would set his jaw against it, and they would stand together in the early light while the Texas morning organized itself around them. The mockingbirds, the distant highway, the smell of the soil. This was the whole of it. This was enough. The sun is going down over the Texas Panhandle the way it has always gone down over that land, in extravagant gold and amber, the sky too large to be contained in a single frame. Vienna sits on the porch steps with a glass of iced tea sweating in the heat, and across the wide paddock, Goliath moves along the fence line at an unhurried walk. He pauses at the far post. He turns his enormous head and looks at the woman on the porch steps. She raises her glass, just slightly, a private thing between two creatures who have agreed to trust each other. He goes back to his walk. The narrator closes. The greatest force in this world is not fear. It is not wealth or power or the kind of authority that comes from a badge or a document or a truck with chrome trim. The greatest force is a heart that refuses to be broken by those things, that stands at a fence in the dark and reaches out its bare hand, that sees what is suffering behind what is dangerous and decides that the difference matters. Vienna Callaway lost her husband. She nearly lost her land. She nearly lost everything that defined the shape of her life. What she never lost was the knowledge of how to approach something broken without adding to the breaking. And because of that, because of one woman and one horse and one October night in the red dust of West Texas, an entire county learned something it had forgotten. That courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is what happens when you extend your hand anyway. If the story of Vienna and Goliath found something in your chest that needed finding, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment below telling us what city you are watching from tonight. Tell us what part of this story hit you hardest. We read every one. We will see you in the next one.